Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for joining us on this discussion on Ukraine, war in Ukraine, Turkey's policy and geopolitical implications for NATO. We have three distinguished guests with us today. Luke Coffey is with the Heritage Foundation. He is the director of Allison Center for Foreign Policy Studies. We have Amanda Paul. She's joining us from Brussels. She's a senior policy analyst with European Policy Center. And we also have Kılıç Kanat, my colleague. He's our research director at the CETA Foundation at Washington, D.C. My name is Kadir Üstün. I'm the executive director at CETA Foundation at Washington, D.C. I want to thank all of them for joining us and thank all in the Zoom joining us as well. And I want to get started right away. Amanda, thank you again. You're in Europe, you're in the, there is a NATO summit coming up, Leader Summit. It's been a very, very busy month. There are so many developments on this front. That's why I didn't even try to summarize. We have a Putin that seems to be still playing hardball. We have, European, NATO, EU unity. We have strong American support in terms of military aid. And then we have also Turkey's role in diplomacy and also support to Ukraine as well. So without talking too much, I'd like to give the floor to you to assess the European response and how Europeans are looking at this. And you can also talk about maybe how Europeans are looking at Turkey's policy as well. Thank you.
No, thank you. And thank you for the invitation to this event. It's always a pleasure to speak here. So I'll try and be quite brief, or that's quite difficult because it's a very, elaborate topic. But I'll start with the response of the EU. I think, the EU, like, most countries around the world, really didn't expect Russia to invade Ukraine. They probably expected something smaller in the Donbass. This didn't happen. So it came as a very large and ugly surprise, if I can put it that way. But I mean, I think over the last 3 weeks, we've seen the EU respond in a very robust way. I think the fact that the courage that has been shown by Ukrainian people, by the government, and by President Zelensky has really galvanized the EU support. As you mentioned, we've seen unprecedented unity. And I think this is a reflection of the real gravity of the situation. I mean, anything else and this unity would have been unthinkable. I mean, we're seeing the slaughter of civilians in Ukraine every single day. And it's absolutely appalling. There are blatant war crimes going on, including dropping bombs on civilian infrastructure, including hospitals where we have pregnant women and babies. I mean, it's a huge act of cruelty. That's unimaginable that somebody could actually want to do this, but this seems to be now the approach of the Russian Federation to go after ordinary civilians because they haven't been able to be successful in their original plans to, try and take Ukraine within 1 or 2 days. This has failed, so they're going after civilians. I think we've seen what I would call a geopolitical awakening from the EU. This war has sort of empowered Europe to take more responsibility, and including more responsibility for their own security. And this has now been backed up, I would say, by public opinion across EU 27, supporting the idea that the EU should take more responsibility for its security and defense. And of course, we've seen now the EU move to actually provide finance and arms to Ukraine. I mean, this is something that was unthinkable a few weeks ago, particularly from the case of Germany, which has had a complete revolution in its policy. But I think the key policy of the EU has been, obviously, they're still trying, diplomacy, although it doesn't seem to be much good. I mean, Monsieur Macron calls up President Putin every now and then, but I mean, these conversations don't amount to anything. So the EU has been very robust in terms of sanctions. They've now placed 4 rounds of sanctions, quite tough sanctions, I would say, on individuals, on companies, obviously the ban on SWIFT and whatnot. And these sanctions have been placed very quickly, but I mean, each round has come after the other one quite rapidly. I think there could have been more done. I mean, they could have, included all banks in SWIFT. They could have sanctioned every single politician in Russia, every single oligarch and whatnot. These are still things that could be done. And next week, there's going to be a discussion on a 5th round of sanctions. And this is a really important discussion because you're now starting to see, I would say, cracks within the EU, because many member states want energy, oil and gas to now be on the table to stop all oil and gas imports from Russia, because we know that the EU has been, really stupid, despite the fact that Russia has used energy as a geopolitical tool. It has been weaponized for many years. I mean, if we go back to 2008, for example, there was a serious gas crisis where Russia turned off the taps. And back in 2008, the EU said, oh, we're going to diversify our energy sources. We're going to stop buying Russian gas. That hasn't happened. I mean, today, I think the EU imports more gas than it was back in 2008. And in addition to that, we know very well that Germany had built this new Nord Stream 2 gas pipeline. Obviously, that project has now been frozen. But I mean, this shows how very short-sighted the EU is, because obviously Russia is getting millions of dollars every day now from gas and oil exports. I think the price of a barrel of oil now is $115. It's almost double than what it was 1 year ago. So basically the EU money is financing this war. So there's an urgency to put an end to this as quickly as possible. But unfortunately, some member states, Germany, for example, is resisting putting the oil and gas on the table at next week's meeting on new sanctions. So how that's going to go, I really don't know. But I think this is a dangerous crack in the unity that has been shown so far. Now I just say a couple of words about Turkey, because I know that I've already taken quite a bit of time for this opening comment. I mean, I think the view from Europe when it comes to Turkey is that Turkey is trying to keep a foot in either camp, that Turkey wants to weather this storm with the least possible impact. Turkey doesn't really want to pick sides. You could say that Turkey wants to have its cake and has eaten it. I mean, we know that Turkey voted for the UN General Assembly resolution condemning Russia. It closed the Turkish Straits, and it has positively stood shoulder to shoulder with its NATO allies. And I think this was received very well, and it's gone a long way to helping Turkey improve its image in the alliance, which was, to be frank, tarnished somewhat over the last few years. But on the other flip side, we sort of moved to a situation now where it's become clearer that Turkey hasn't joined sanctions on Russia, and is very unlikely to do so, because Turkey doesn't do sanctions. It also didn't close its airspace to Russian aircraft, which member states of the EU did. I mean, I think perhaps there is some understanding in the EU as to why Turkey did that. I mean, obviously, Turkey is intertwined with Russia in several areas, in Syria, in Libya, and you also have, the domestic issues, refugees, the energy. Turkey is very dependent on energy from Russia, wheat imports, etc. All these things have to be considered, and the possible blowback from Russia if Turkey was to sanction or join sanctions on Russia could be huge, given what happened in 2015 after Turkey shot down this Russian jet. It could, let's say, further exacerbate Turkey's already very difficult economic situation. I'm guessing that, President Erdogan wouldn't be very keen on that just about a year before elections. So I don't think this is going to change. But I do think perhaps there would be obviously a preference from the transatlantic allies for Turkey to do that. The other point I would make before I stop in these initial short remarks is I think there's a bit of disappointment regarding some of the remarks carried out by President Erdogan, but also others. There's been several times when the West has been blamed for this war, and NATO has been blamed for this war. I mean, I find this a bit bizarre because, first of all, when you're talking about this situation, Turkey is part of the West. I mean, in Antalya last week, President Erdogan, in his opening comments, said that the West should have done more after Crimea was annexed. I mean, so could have Turkey, quite frankly. So I didn't quite understand that comment. I mean, the West actually sanctioned Russia. At that point, Turkey didn't. And also, Turkey is a member of NATO. And if my memory serves me correctly, I mean, Turkey was actually one of the strongest voices underlining Ukraine's right to be a NATO member, and Georgia's. So I think those sorts of things are worrying. Also, the fact that there's so much Russian disinformation circling around in Turkey. I think this is a challenge. More should be done to prevent that. But my last comment, on a more positive note, I think that there's a great deal of positive energy for Turkey's efforts to mediate a solution to this Russian war. The fact that the Foreign Minister Çavuşoğlu managed to get Lavrov and Dmytro Kuleba down to Antalya and have this conversation was good. I know that he's also been in Ukraine. I think yesterday he saw the situation on the ground, how awful it is, how much humanitarian atrocities are taking place. So I do think that Turkey's ability to get the two sides together should be welcomed, and Turkey should continue to pursue its efforts in this direction, which I think is the right thing to do. And also Turkey has it's quite unique as well in many ways to be able to do this. So I will finish my opening comments there.
Thank you very much, Amanda. I'll just say on my part, I think that comment by the president referred to sort of, the military support becoming earlier maybe, but I'll allow, of course, Kılıç and Luke if they have anything else to add to that. But I want to turn to Luke about that. So Luke, the US, Zelensky spoke to US Congress. Prior to that, he had spoken to Canadian Parliament and also EU Parliament. And there is huge, support in terms of moral support and celebration, etc. And then there's a lot of military support. The US is giving now drones and other materials, military equipment to perhaps try to achieve air cover for Ukrainians. How do you evaluate the US policy, and how, from your perspective, how does Turkey's policy look? Thank you.
Thanks. And thanks to SETA for inviting me to speak and being a part of this panel. It's coming at a very important time. We're experiencing seismic changes in geopolitics right now. In my opinion, we are in uncharted territory where anything is possible, nothing can be ruled out, nothing should be ruled out, and we should start planning for any and every eventuality. And in many ways, I was thinking about how quickly these changes are occurring. In the same way, it was like the first several weeks of the pandemic, when we as a society leapt perhaps a decade into the future in terms of remote work, doing this panel like this today, right, on Zoom from, Amanda's in Brussels, I'm in Washington, and we do this like it's a completely normal thing. Whereas, in February of 2020, we would have, been stressed out about making sure the logistics worked for an event like this online. So in the same way that we leapt ahead in terms of remote work and doing things virtually because of the pandemic, events in Ukraine have forced us to leap ahead in transatlantic security and transatlantic relations in a way that probably would have otherwise taken years. The example Amanda gave about the European Commission financing 500 million euros worth of weapons to a non-member state. I am hugely critical of the common security and defense policy of the EU. I wouldn't have guessed in a million years that the EU Commission would have ever agreed to such an initiative, but it did, and it's doing other things as well. Or the change in attitudes by Finland and Sweden to joining NATO, or Switzerland signing up for sanctions, or now the UK being, it's now, before it was always the US and EU and talks about, Russia, the EU and US and talks about China. Now it's completely a common thing to say the US, UK, and the EU are meeting to discuss Russia. So that anxiety that existed after Brexit about, well, what role does the UK play in European relations, European security? We've already moved past that, and we did so very rapidly. So with that being said, I suspect many across Europe and also in the United States thought that the topic of a panel being held 3 weeks after the start of the invasion would be about how do we arm the resistance, or how do we, stop Russia from advancing onto Poland, or how do we, continue sanctions even though Russia has been successful in Ukraine. People probably thought that this would be the outcome 3 weeks later, but it hasn't been. And the Ukrainians have been fighting very bravely and gallantly. And I think we're at a point now where, because we are in uncharted territory, because anything now seems possible, we should be starting to plan for an outcome where Ukraine is victorious on the battlefield inside Ukraine. Now, I would say this is different from preparing for a Russian defeat. A Russian defeat in Ukraine doesn't necessarily mean a Russian defeat for the regime in Moscow. It could, we just don't know at this point. But, I could see a situation now where after successive military defeats on the battlefield inside Ukraine, Russian forces withdraw, at least to the pre-February 2022 lines. But who knows what, even perhaps even further, who knows, anything could be possible at this point. So we need to start planning for this eventuality. In terms of the US approach and how I see things playing out from Washington, looking at NATO's approach and also Turkey's approach, a few things about the US policy. I do believe that we were a bit slow at leading on the implementation of these severe sanctions. Now that we have them, they're great. They're historically unprecedented in terms of their size and scope. And as Amanda said, there's even more room to add more sanctions. And I hear some administration officials saying that they're keeping extra sanctions in their back pocket in case they're needed. Well, now's the time to take them out of the back pocket. They're needed now. And if we think we get to the point where we've run out of things to sanction and we need to find more sanctions, then we need to get creative, and we need to worry about that problem later in the future. But right now, now's the time to implement all of the sanctions that we have available, not to wait for Russian tanks to be in the center of Kyiv. I think that the military support the US has provided has been very positive. The president announced yesterday a further $800 million. In total, the U.S. Congress just passed authorization for spending of about $13 billion in total for Ukraine assistance. I mean, this is almost 3 times Ukraine's annual defense budget. And some of these capabilities that have been provided, the Javelin, the Stingers, and some of the new capabilities that will be sent soon, like the Switchblade tactical drone, these are having and will have a devastating impact on the battlefield against the Russian Federation. So we need to make sure, like, my big concern now is that we start to lose steam at providing these weapons and providing this assistance, and we don't work closely with our allies in Europe to make sure we come up with a systematic and enduring process to ensure the continued supply of these weapon systems to the Ukrainians. Right now, I mean, because we're only 3 weeks into this, it all feels still a little ad hoc. Country X says they give 500 Stingers. Country Y says they give 2,000 anti-tank missiles. The United States announces this massive, support package. And they all we think it all goes to Poland and somehow magically appears on the battlefields in Ukraine. We need to find a way to make this approach more systematic and enduring, especially if Russia tries to cut the supply lines off. In terms of NATO, again, I go back to my earlier point about how this has really put us years ahead in terms of our thinking about NATO's role in transatlantic security. Crucially and interestingly, and coincidentally, I should say, NATO is in the process of undergoing its strategic concept program, where the strategic concept is a document that's published that is meant to offer guidance to NATO's policymakers going into the future on dealing with new threats and challenges. The last one that was published, if you can believe it, was from 2010, before a lot of things, before the Arab Spring, before Syria, before Afghanistan fell, before Crimea in 2014, obviously, before the Libya operation, before the second Russian invasion of Ukraine, before the Second Karabakh War and the geopolitical implications of that for transatlantic security. So a lot of things, and before the pandemic, and before this rise of China, right? So in fact, it's a 40-page document, and if you open it up, you don't find the words China or pandemic at all in this document. So clearly it was out of date. We're doing a new one now, and hopefully what Russia is doing is going to really focus the minds of NATO, that NATO needs to get back to basics. It doesn't have to be everywhere in the world doing everything, but it does have to be in the North Atlantic region, north of the Tropic of Cancer. Those aren't my words. Those are the words of the 1949 treaty. NATO has to be in this area, able to defend the territory of its member states. And then finally, a bit on the Turkey's role in this and U.S.-Turkish relations. It's weird. What you see publicly and what you hear privately from officials are kind of two different things. I mean, the public message is very much one of balancing, making sure that Turkey can position itself to be an honest broker between the two sides. And this is needed, especially in this sort of geopolitical situation. You need a big country like Turkey that can serve as this broker, a potential broker of peace. But privately, I mean, at least in my experiences, the hearts of the people I talk to from Turkey are definitely on the side of the Ukrainians. And, it is a curious form of neutrality in a way. When you think about how, closing the Turkish Straits doesn't necessarily impact immediately the Russia's Black Sea presence, but it will start impacting greatly Russia's military presence in Syria, for example. The Bayraktar TB2 drones, which are proving once again to be very effective. Although it's not advertised publicly, I do hope that, Ukraine is being resupplied with munitions and spare parts to keep these things running and keep these things flying. But then, of course, President Erdogan has major economic concerns as well. And, this is probably these economic concerns in Turkey, coupled with the necessity of having a country like Turkey be seen as an honest broker on both sides, is probably what keeps Ankara away from these international economic sanctions. Can Turkey deliver the goods in terms of a ceasefire or an enduring peace? Honestly, I don't think either side is really at that point anyway. But like I said, it's important to have, a country like Turkey that can play this role. Now, in terms of U.S.-Turkish relations, I think that there's a possibility to to see this situation in Ukraine as a way to improve the bilateral relationship between the U.S. and Turkey. The whole world can see the atrocities that the Russian military is committing inside Ukraine. And I think this has also been a wake-up call for many in Turkey. Although we see this pragmatic relationship between President Erdogan and President Putin over the years, I don't see any fundamental shift in Turkey's alignment being closer to Russia in any meaningful or lasting way. If we're seeing a change in Turkey's alignment in regional geopolitics to be closer to Russia, then that means we're going against about 500 years of history, and I don't think we're at that point. And I think the situation in Ukraine could be a wake-up call for both U.S. policymakers and Turkish policymakers that, hey, we have a good relationship. We've had one for 7 decades. We've had 7 or so challenging years, but we need to find a way through some of these existing challenges in the relationship and overcome them. So I'm hoping it'll be a wake-up call. And one thing that I find, somewhat hilarious is that some of the same congressmen, a couple of years ago who were like advocating for the banning of U.S. export of component parts for the TB2 are now these big champions of the TB2 drone. It just shows like this very short-sighted and naive approach taken by some in the United States on the importance of Turkey in the region in terms of security and stability. So I'll stop there. I see some questions are already coming in, but I guess we'll wait until the
yes, Luke, actually you incidentally answered one of them already. I think that question from Jeffrey Steiner was, can Turkey guarantee Russian compliance with any Ukraine-Russia compromise deal next week? But you said that no actor at this point can really guarantee anything like that. And Kılıç, I want to turn to you quickly about this. You've heard quite a bit. If you can start with the Turkey's policy, and also the Zoom attendees, please post your questions to Q&A box if possible. Thank you. Kılıç, floor is yours.
Before the panel, when we were discussing, Kadir put me under pressure by saying that I talk too much, so I will try to summarize my points and I will try to make it as concise as possible. So the crisis, one, I agree with Luke that about the geopolitical changes, but the parts are still very much moving. So there is a lot of uncertainty. So when we look at even the NATO strategic concept, we will probably see a lot of changes in the language in the next couple of months until the Madrid summit about the document, about the priorities. Because if you see in Brussels, the atmosphere was mostly US is willing to focus more on Asia, more on China, and probably and do not consider Russia as a significant threat for the transatlantic relations. But now we will probably see a lot of at least changes on that. In regards to Turkey's policy, I think there are 3 points. So number one is Turkey has been dealing with conflicts around its neighborhood. Think about starting from the Iraq war, the Syria conflict, the confrontation between the West and Iran, Azerbaijan and Armenia war, the invasion of Georgia, and now Ukraine. It is literally closing the geographical gap with this conflict. So for Turkey, the first priority is, of course, the humanitarian tragedy and potential impacts that a civil war or a war in that country can create for the region. Because in Turkey's experience in regards to Syria war, Turkey has seen that these kind of conflicts can turn into basically start exporting actually insecurities to its adjacent regions. And it can be destabilizing for the politics and the economy in the region. So number one is to prevent a humanitarian tragedy, to prevent a major and prolonged war around its border again. Because of that, the ceasefire is playing a significant role. Turkey's priority is to achieve ceasefire here, to establish a ground for the negotiations. Number two is, of course, the economy. And Amanda, I guess, mentioned a little bit about the economy. But it is not about Turkey's economy. Turkey and Russia and Turkey and Ukraine had excellent economic relations and growing economic relations. Not only on tourism, especially in Russia, in agricultural trade, in fossil fuels and energy relations. So for Turkey, this is, of course, important, but Turkey also considers potential outcomes of a prolonged conflict in the region and its impact for the global economy, because we are talking about 9th largest economy in the world, and having significant impact on having a long war probably can cause not only a economic damage for Turkey, but all the region as well. And number three, there is a diplomatic self-confidence in Turkey, especially when it comes to Russia. For the last, I would say, 7 to 8 years, Turkey and Russia had faced, basically had discourse, disputes, disagreements on multiple different regions. Although in Washington, it always looked like Turkey is shifting axis or Turkey is getting a more pro-Russian policy. When we look at the conflicts from Libya to Syria, even at certain points to Karabakh conflict, we have seen that in many instances, Russia and Turkey had significant discourse, significant disagreements, but achieved to freeze or manage those conflicts through diplomacy and diplomatic negotiations. So Turkey believes that Turkey can create this in Ukraine as well. And because of that, I was in Antalya last week when the forum was taking place, and when the meeting between the Russian foreign minister and Ukrainian foreign minister take place, and the fact that Turkish foreign minister visited Moscow and Kiev on the 15th and on the 17th of March demonstrated that there is a follow-up of this meeting, and we will see what will this bring. Turkey is, of course, among some actors like Israel, like India, who's trying to broker a deal, at least to get a ceasefire at this point. And from its previous experience, there is a self-confidence among Turkey's foreign policy makers that they can do this as well at this point. Regarding this impact of this war to Turkish-US relations, I guess Luke summarized it well. There is a recent revival of interest, let me say, in Washington in regards to Turkey. And this was a little delayed because there was a very anti-Turkey attitude in some circles in Washington, D.C., but there was no answer for the very simple question, what could US gain by destroying its relations with Turkey? Nobody could answer this question, but there was not a Turkey policy, but there was an attitude towards Turkey. So in the last at least 2-3 weeks, I can observe at least, there may not be significant changes right now, but at least there is a growing interest to Turkey, growing interest to try to understand Turkey's priorities and what US and Turkey can do together. And I think this is, like every crisis creates some opportunities. I think this can create an opportunity for Turkey and US to rethink about its relations and the crisis areas. At the end of the day, the strategic relations between Turkey and United States started with a crisis between US and Soviet Union just before the Cold War years. And this is another crisis. And Turkey has basically, in the last 10 years at least, draw a significant strategic autonomy for itself, although never exclude itself from the international agreements, NATO international organizations. But there was this increasing focus on regional crisis and what Turkey can contribute to resolution of these crises. I think this was at certain points misunderstood, misjudged in Washington. And I think through this crisis, there can be an opportunity for two countries to get together and rethink what are the crisis areas and what are the potential solutions. Because Turkey considered US sanctions and increasing US sanctions in US foreign policy towards multiple different countries detrimental to US diplomacy and US foreign relations with Turkey. And I think there is now a ground for not thinking through only sanctions, but also the creative aspect of diplomacy and how and to find innovative solutions for the problems between Turkey and United States. I think the phone call between Biden and Erdogan signaled that, and I think the subsequent phone calls between diplomatic traffic actually with Turkey and Western powers, when we look at the last 2 weeks, and this somehow overlapped with Turkey's normalization with Israel, Turkey's normalization with United Arab Emirates. And when we look at the diplomatic traffic for the last 2 weeks, we can see that there is a now window of opportunity. And if two countries wanted to resolve their conflicts, I think this would be a good time to find solutions for them.
Kılıç, since you mentioned Israel and India, I want to pose this one question to you. This is from Robert Pearson. The Financial Times claims that it's Israel that's doing the real negotiating, but I've otherwise seen little that would support this line. And what is your view of the Israelis, what they're doing vis-a-vis what Turks are doing? Kılıç.
I think any agreement, any attempt to resolve this crisis would be welcomed in Ankara. So Ankara is, I guess, showed its readiness to contribute for at least right now to find to broker a ceasefire agreement, so that the cost of the war, especially for the civilians in Ukraine, wouldn't grow too much. But if other countries are doing these kind of brokering and trying to mediate the dispute, I think Turkey would welcome any attempt that would contribute for this, like cessation of, at this point, hostilities in.
Thank you, Kılıç. Amanda, I'll ask for your patience. There's a question about Georgia, and I want to pose that to Luke. He's our, I think, premier expert on Georgia. Not many people know much about Georgia, to be honest. But this question is about, it says basically Russians coming to Georgia and registering businesses in Georgia to avoid sanctions. What do you think about that? Would that bring sort of Georgia into the crosshairs in terms of sanctions? And also the other thing is, do you think that Georgia has an opportunity to do something about its occupied regions? For instance, the president of Moldova called Russia to withdraw its military forces from Transnistria.
Yeah. Well, firstly, I think Amanda and I first met, I think maybe in Georgia, so or something to do with Georgia. So Amanda knows a lot about Georgia as well, I should say. But on those two questions,
my apologies.
The first one, the first question, if there's a systematic approach by the Georgian government to create a safe haven for Russian businessmen to skirt international sanctions, then yes, that's a problem. However, I've seen no evidence that this is the case. There's no doubt that many Russian businessmen will be trying to find loopholes and everything else. And if the U.S. Department of Justice sees any evidence of this happening in Georgia, then I think before applying sanctions, the best approach would be for the U.S. government to approach the Georgian government and say, hey, this is what we're noticing, this is what we're seeing. Let's try to work together to stop this. But if it's a systematic approach to undermine international sanctions, then yes, and for any country, I think perhaps sanctions should be considered. On the second question, yeah, well, this goes back to my point about we are in uncharted territory. Anything is possible. Anything could happen. Of course, right now the Georgian government, and this has been the policy of multiple governments in Georgia, but the Georgian government very wisely has a non-use of force pledge when it comes to getting back the two occupied regions of Shkin or also referred to as South Ossetia, and Abkhazia. However, we have seen videos surface on the internet of Russian troops leaving Shkin region, heading to Ukraine. Apparently, some of these soldiers have already been spotted in Ukraine. Also, I've heard also that Russian troops from Karabakh, or the peacekeepers, some of them are starting to be diverted to Ukraine. Who knows if this is happening, but it's not out of the realm of possibility, especially when you look at the size of losses and deaths that the Russian military is taking in Ukraine. But could this offer an opportunity for Georgia? I would say it certainly does offer an opportunity for Georgia, depending on what happens to the Russian military in Ukraine, depending on what happens to Putin in Moscow, to what happens to this current regime in Moscow. I think we're in this moment of uncertainty where policymakers have to be planning for everything. And if the Russian military faces a defeat inside Ukraine, and then there's political upheaval or even some sort of coup in Moscow, then who knows what the ripple effect might be to places like Abkhazia, Shkin Transnistria, Karabakh, the large Russian military presence in Armenia, the Russian military presence in Tajikistan. Who knows? It could, anything is possible at this point. Would I be recommending to Georgians to start mobilizing their forces to liberate these two occupied regions? No, I wouldn't go that far. But would I be advocating, and have I been advocating for the U.S. to start, providing even more weapons to Georgians? Yes, of course, Ukraine needs to remain our main effort. But when there's capacity and possibility, we also need to be providing more javelins, more stingers, more other types of weapons to the Georgians as well.
Thank you, Luke. There's one question from Michael Kurtzik. Is Turkey assisting with refugees on the Ukrainian border? Has it welcomed refugees or sent food and medicine? I actually have a quick answer to this. Just yesterday, I was speaking to someone from the Turkish management of what is the institution's name? Disaster Management Agency of Turkey, AFAD. Their members are in Moldova. Yes, they are in actually Moldova. They're assisting with the refugee situation. Kılıç, do you want to add anything to this?
Last week, one number was released. More than 20,000 Ukrainian refugees came to Turkey. And those were mostly Ukrainians who have some relatives and who have some connections in Turkey. They fled to Turkey. And both Turkey's Crescent and the Disaster Management Authority in Turkey basically sent help for the refugees. And more important Recently, since the beginning of the Syrian refugee crisis, actually, Turkish civil society has been very proactive and can be very efficient in raising basic donations and sending help for the refugees. And I have been following some civil society organizations. They launch massive campaigns in Turkey and started to send some help for the refugees actually who passed the border, especially Lviv and some other cities in Ukraine.
Amanda, thank you for your patience. One question is about SWIFT. You made a comment about that. Isn't it short-sighted to demand 100% block on SWIFT right now, which would cut off Russian gas to Germany during winter temperatures that would undermine German support for a unified Western front against Russia? Wouldn't it be better to make the total SWIFT move in 3 weeks when no pipes will freeze? And I have actually, besides this, one more question for you. The migration situation in Europe, we've seen very different, approaches by individual countries. Especially the UK has been very careful. For instance, how do you see the refugee debate in Europe, given the larger context of migration?
I mean, on the first question, I don't agree. Neither does President Zelensky. I mean, anybody who listened to his speech in the Bundestag today, he gave, a clear message of what needs to be done. 3 weeks is rather a long time. I mean, 3 weeks has already passed. We shouldn't have to wait another 3 weeks. I mean, I don't mind turning off my heating, quite frankly, if it's going to help Ukraine. So I think that these sanctions should be implemented immediately vis-a-vis SWIFT. I also believe that all other loopholes should be closed, because there's still plenty of loopholes in the sanctions, and they should be tracking sanction avoidance, because there are issues regarding sanctions avoidance. And if I can just make a couple of other points before I come to the issue of migration. I think at this point it's really important that financial assistance should be provided to support the work that needs to be done to document war crimes and war crime atrocity, particularly photographic evidence and taking statements from Ukrainians who have had to flee. Because I mean, I want to see President Putin in The Hague and all of the rest of his cronies who are responsible for this. So this should be an urgent issue. I also think that a message should be sent to Ukraine that all its international debt is going to be cancelled. And this is something that should happen very quickly, because when this is over, when Ukraine is victorious, I mean, there's going to be an awful lot of rebuilding and reconstructing that's going to take a lot of time and a lot of money, and this is going to require significant investments from the partners in the West. On your last point, I mean, I should have mentioned at the beginning, because I think the response of the EU has been amazing in terms of welcoming, I think it's over 2 million refugees from Ukraine. And of course, this number could significantly increase. I mean, Poland at the moment has the most, but also there's large numbers in other countries. And we're seeing more of these numbers or more people move further west. I can't say, I mean, Belgium has welcomed, I mean, I'm in Belgium. Belgium has also welcomed now a lot. I can't say that their systems for registering refugees is particularly efficient or great. But still, we can see that societies across the European Union have really opened their hearts, their homes. I mean, everybody wants to give their spare bedroom to a Ukrainian refugee family. Also, I think what's really important is that they've all been, granted the right to study, the right to work, free movement. So basically having the same rights as me or any other EU citizen, which is important. I mean, this is, obviously a very different response to the calls to accept refugees from Afghanistan and before that Syria, where some of the countries which said we want to take Ukrainians immediately, back then said we don't want to take Syrians or Afghans. I mean, this for me was, very disappointing. It's a very racist approach, unfortunately. But I mean, I would hope in the future we wouldn't see this again. But unfortunately, I don't think this is going to be the case for many member states. I mean, it should have nothing to do with culture or background or whatnot. I mean, these people have all had to flee for their lives, and they should be treated equally. But I mean, on the Ukrainian case, you can see that there's been a widespread acceptance and wanting to help them in any way they can.
So we've come to the end of our time. If the gentlemen have nothing else to add at this point, I would like to end with Amanda's comments. I think this has been an excellent, compact discussion. We've been able to provide several different perspectives, the US, EU, and Turkey. I really appreciate our distinguished guests' contributions, and I want to thank all those in the Zoom and who posed their questions as well. We will unfortunately perhaps have to continue discussing Ukraine. Maybe there will be better developments in the weeks ahead. That's what we are hoping for. Luke and Kılıç, if you don't have anything else, I'm going to end the session here. Thank you all for joining us.